भारत सरकार कर चीफ इकोनॉमिक एडवाइजर प्रेसमिट करुछंती सदाशरख नहीं जाउछु
context that the era of globalization, faster and larger movement of trade and goods and services and investments is behind us, and there is a huge presence of a single country, a phenomena that we have not seen in a very long time, at least since World War II. So given this, naturally we have to raise the game for a new playing field. The playing field has changed, and the game has to be rely on domestic drivers of growth. So what are those domestic drivers of growth? That is what is part 2 about. Just to recap, we do have a goal, a legitimate economic and social aspiration to become a developed country by 2047. The last economic survey broke it down into multiple components, generating about 80 lakh jobs per year, increasing our share of manufacturing in GDP, plugging Indian businesses into global value chains, and creating a viable small medium enterprise sector, which in the German language is called the Mittelstand. Because countries that basically became powerhouses in manufacturing had succeeded in creating a viable small medium enterprise sector. Therefore, our goal with respect to manufacturing is inextricably tied to the success of being able to raise the share of SME enterprises as well. Therefore, what is the action? The action is we have to raise our game on domestic growth. Succeeded in creating a viable small medium enterprise sector. Therefore, our goal with respect to manufacturing is inextricably tied to the success of being able to raise the share of SME enterprises as well. Therefore, what is the action? The action is we have to raise our game on domestic growth. And how do we do that? There are 4 dimensions to it. One is deregulation for growth, augmenting internal capacities for growth, the role of the private sector in nation building, and doing energy transition the Indian way. First, we start with the deregulation for growth. Now, when we talk of deregulation, it is not even big ticket deregulation or dismantling of the licensing era, which happened in 1991 and pursued by governments over the last 30 plus years. We are talking about the nuts and bolts or the plumbing of deregulation, which particularly affect enterprises, be they in services or be they in manufacturing, which affect them in terms of the time and the resource bandwidth that they have. And these are related to local level rules, laws, and regulations. So this is the deregulation exercise, which will probably not be a news story in the front pages, but that kind of deregulation at the local and the state government level have to happen pervasively for us not only to boost MSMEs, to boost manufacturing, but also to lift the potential GDP growth in the country. And this applies in the areas of labor and even in the education sector as well. We'll share with you a few examples. These are the areas where I think the regulations that are there today affect the day-to-day activities of businesses that don't have the kind of bandwidth which large enterprises have. Whether it is in land, building and construction, utilities, logistics, and there are sector-specific deregulation areas, and you can see more of them in Chapter 5 and also across other chapters in the economic survey. In general, we are obviously in the presentation, I can't go into all the issues which are there in the chapter. Just to illustrate, compliance costs make it cheaper to run 150 worker factory than 300 worker factory, whereas it should be other way around. Regulations also disproportionately affect small businesses. If you look at the building restrictions, the setbacks to be allowed on all the 4 sides of a building, the floor area ratio restrictions, parking regulations, etc., take away much of the land available at the ground floor level for businesses. So actually manufacturing can start only from the first floor onwards in many small enterprises, both in urban and rural India, if they fully comply with the letter and spirit of these regulations. Naturally, that raises the fixed cost of doing business, and naturally it also disincentivizes more hiring. So deregulation is not just about ease of doing business, it is a pathway to employment generation. And naturally, we also know that many states impose a high markup on electricity costs supplied to businesses compared to other non-businesses. And whereas in countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh, particularly in Vietnam, which we look up to, it is the other way around in terms of being our next important competitive country. They have the opposite problem, which is that the cost of electricity supplied to industries is on the lowest side there compared to what we have in India. And by the way, this is not just a theoretical exercise. We have done, and you will see more of it in chapter 7, we looked at those states which have progressed a lot on business reform action plan, and lo and behold, those states have a much higher level of industrial activity. So there is a positive correlation between BRAP and the level of industrial activity that is there in these states. Moving on from industry to employment-related areas where deregulation can be pursued, in general, we do specify the number of hours workers can work daily and weekly. Every country has it. But the problem is we have restrictions that this shall be adhered to week after week after week, whereas other countries give flexibility to the enterprises to be able to achieve this over a longer period, 3 months or 6 months. Your overall working hours cannot exceed this. But in a given week, there could be more or less work depending on demand surges. So that flexibility is missing. The same thing with respect to Factories Act on overtime working hours as well. The stipulated overtime hours are lower than competing nations, even though the overtime wages are higher in India on paper. The hours that people can be asked to work overtime is limited, and this is something that the workers and the management can negotiate between themselves depending on order flows and so on and so forth. Moving on to higher education in particular, where I think market forces can play a much better role in ensuring quality outcomes. The University Grants Commission specifies minimum credits for various course categories and in what sequence as well. These aspects could be entrusted to the institutions themselves, and the institutions must remain free to remain flexible with their coursework. This will allow them to adapt to changing market demands, and we should basically trust the faculty and students to find solutions to these problems. These are all areas where we don't have to micromanage, and that is something, this is just examples of deregulation we can undertake in industry, employment, and education. Moving on to part B of domestic drivers of growth. This is to continue to do the work we have been doing in the last 10 years on augmenting internal capacities for growth. And in July 2024, in agriculture, we devoted a lot of time in both Chapter 5 on the medium-term outlook on how agriculture can be freed in terms of empowering farmers to be able to produce the maximum value and raise productivity. And we deliberately call it the sector of the future because there is enough scope to raise the contribution of agriculture by 0.75% to 1% in terms of GDP growth by empowering farmers, as we wrote in the last July survey. And there are examples which we have cited in this survey as well from different states, and also both in terms of land pooling and also in terms of irrigation potential, which we have done quite well in the last 8 years. The area under micro irrigation has gone up by 3 times, and that can actually be an important factor. So bringing more area under irrigation, land pooling, and giving farmers the freedom to sell wherever, whenever, to whomsoever, at whatever prices, while undertaking different intervention mechanisms to take care of the demand side. That is the right combination that can unlock up to 1% of incremental growth from the agriculture sector. And given our size and given the impact climate change will have on some other nations in Africa and Asia, this will also give India a huge diplomatic and strategic leverage if we are able to become the breadbasket for many countries around the world. So this sector is not something that countries do well in their early stage of development, but given the change in globalization and given climate change, this sector can be a sector for the future as well. And as you see here,